Our podcast lead presenter David Balkwell has 30 years of certification assessment experience and has undertaken over 7,000 days of certification assessment. He worked full-time for BSI as operations manager for 10 years before setting up his own business carrying out independent certification assessment over the last 20 years with 19 accredited certification bodies. ISO Builder is a registered trademark of Balkwell Limited. All online content is protected by international copyright and the Trademarks Act 1994. ISO Builder Online is not responsible, liable, nor necessarily support views as expressed by our podcast presenters in any way. They are their own interpretation and views. We accept no liability for any content. Patrons should always source confirmatory opinions regarding interpretations of management systems in relation to their own situation and intended use. No content is intended to be offensive in any way.
This session is about compliance obligation in relation to ISO 45001 2018 and ISO 14001 2015. In fact, the requirements for compliance obligation, the determination of legal and other requirements, as it's known in ISO 45001, goes back many versions of health and safety and environmental standards. So thinking about health and safety, back in the late 90s we had BS 8800. That included requirements for determination of legal and other requirements. Subsequently into OH SAS 18001 and its revisions through to our current management system standard ISO 45001. With regards to ISO 14001, the wording has changed in the 2015 standard to compliance obligation. So we have a variant. Although Annex SL overarches the requirements for management systems, as we well know, the terminology is varied from one to the other. The expectations in terms of process control are the same, so that is common, but it does still provide the distinction between legal and other requirements, which, as we say, was traditionally common in environmental and health and safety management system standards until now. So thinking about compliance obligation, as we'll call it, the requirements actually link very, very well across the management system standards. The expectation in policy in 5.2 in both standards is clear in that the expectations to provide a commitment to fulfill legal requirements and other requirements for health and safety is explicit. Within environmental, the requirement is to make commitment to fulfill its compliance obligation. So it starts off with that kingpin in policy commitment in a management system, something which will be made publicly available to interested parties. So the expectation from the outset is that an organisation will fulfil its compliance obligation. So thinking about then it moving to the requirements with regards to compliance obligation. For health and safety, I'll explain there are three primary steps or requirements which do in fact align with the requirements of ISO 14001, and that is to determine and have access to compliance obligation that are applicable for health and safety to its hazards, occupational health and safety risks and management system, and with regards to environment, its related environmental aspects. Secondly, to determine how these compliance obligations apply to the organisation, and that with regards to health and safety explicitly stating and what needs to be communicated. And thirdly, to take legal requirements and other requirements into account when establishing, implementing, maintaining and continually improving. In the case of 45001, it's occupational health and safety management system. With regards to 14,000, to take the compliance obligations into account when establishing, implementing, maintaining and continually improving its environmental management system. Both health and safety and environment, the expectation is that the organisation maintain documented information. So it's not unreasonable to request or to ask what process control there is around the clause 6.1.3 compliance obligations. So that will typically take the form of a process. So as we well know, within the requirements of all the management systems, it's important to ensure that we achieve intended outcomes, that we determine the processes and their interactions in accordance with the international standard, such that we can form a management system. So each clause will have process requirements that are determined by the organisation to ensure compliance with the standard. So with regards to compliance obligation, a process would identify who, how, where and when. Typically, as you would have done with process control in any other management system, ISO 9000 and ISO 14000 and ISO 45001. So there will be many processes within the management system. Core processes that satisfy clause requirements in the standard, rather than the operations processes that are about delivery of the requirements with regards to quality, environment and health and safety. So thinking about the process itself, who, how, where and when is quite key, because for all the requirements across environment and health and safety, the staff, the individuals that are assigned, have job responsibilities to manage legal requirements need to be competent. So it's not unreasonable to be able to demonstrate and to be able to, if asked, demonstrate competency for the individuals that have been assigned to this particular requirement. And the process itself will identify how this information is identified, the sources that this information is coming from. There are many sources out there. In the UK, the best, and my advice is to stay as close to the governmental bodies that actually issue the legislation. There are many organisations that offer services for update and maintenance of what's deemed to be applicable, and some more generic that simply provide general update to what's new and what's coming through. But nevertheless, the process needs to be available and to be sufficiently well managed, such that the legislation and other requirements that are applicable on a particular site are real, are comprehensive, are kept up to date. And that provides quite a challenge for many organisations. So to subcontract that service is not unreasonable, because there may be resource issues, and it may feel that the paid for service is something which is more accurate than doing it internally. However, if there is sufficient competency in-house, that's really the best way to manage this part of the requirements of ISO 14001 and ISO 45001. So to own the process in-house. There may be a complement of any number of those different process elements that could take place. So it could be that it's managed internally, but there's a simple update service used to support the process, or it could be completely subcontracted. Ownership of it subcontracted is the key, because the important element, as with any management systems clauses, where does this information go to? So we know where it comes from, we know what it does through the process, but the important thing is, where does this information go? It isn't just about producing a register of legislation, it's about this being the catalyst of applicable legal requirements and other requirements for the site. So I'll often find items, pieces of legislation that are on a register that aren't applicable, and it was considered, well, it might be. So there are often very grey lines between what's thought to be, should be on and shouldn't be on. For me, it's quite clear. If it's applicable on the site, then it should be on the register. Now, when I use the term register, there's no requirements in the standard, of course, to actually have a legal register. But when we come to the definitions of documented information, along with the process and how the process actually works, then a lot of people actually do produce a register to be able to demonstrate and to identify, to update something physical. But that really isn't the important part. That's the first steps in producing a legislation register and other requirements register. The important thing is having sufficient knowledge of the legislation itself to be able to use that information, and part of that is understanding the output of this particular process. And this particular process's output becomes an input into, for environment, aspect evaluation, and for health and safety, into risk assessment. Not forgetting there will also be inputs into both environmental and health and safety, risk and opportunity, and the process in determining risk and opportunity. So the outputs are quite complex, but that's why it's very important that the overviews of legislation are sufficiently in plain English that they can be understood, so you can carry across your legal obligation and other requirements obligation into risk assessment and into aspect evaluation and to risk and opportunities management, particularly with regards to risk assessment and aspect evaluation, because that legal obligation can then be placed into operational controls that then become our operational controls in the organisation for explaining to people how a particular physical process should take place or should happen. So then those operational controls not only embed our legal obligation, but best or good practice to undertake whatever that might be, such as an activity working at height or confined spaces or whatever it may be, or waste management or materials deliveries and environmental impacts there that may exist. So the information flow from policy through to compliance obligation, through into aspect evaluation and to risk assessment and risk and opportunities is key. So to have just a register is a starting point, but understanding the content of that, and understanding the content of that is in fact the detail behind the overviews of legislation, sufficient that it can be embraced and embedded into operational requirements. So let's have just also a little discussion around other requirements, which is often confused or has been confused over the years. So legal is where there is an explicit piece of legislation, that be an Act of Parliament in the United Kingdom or a regulation, that is clearly applicable on site to this organisation. However, other requirement is something that is non-legal but is or has been determined to be taken, embedded, embraced, bought into by the organisation, and will as such be thought of as a piece of legislation. So this could be a charter of some kind, a group or company charter. It could be a local environmental initiative on an industrial estate. So something which is often optional to get involved in, but nevertheless then will be deemed to be, seen to be as important as a piece of legislation. But clearly there needs to be distinction between the two. So far we've had this clear distinction, legal requirements and other requirements, which changed in 14,000 in 2015 to compliance obligation. And that compliance obligation actually does still embed other requirements. So it hasn't actually gone away, and it's important to remember that whilst looking at compliance obligation, although it's not over clear in 613 in the standard, the expectation when we look around at guidance for this particular clause clearly includes other requirements. However, in ISO 14000, in ISO 45001, 613, the split has been retained. So we now still have, through from policy to 613, determination of legal and other requirements. So it's a little bit clearer, but it's different to, in terms of the wording, to ISO 14001, but nevertheless the principles are the same. So we're going to have a discussion around evaluation of compliance as a separate session, but what we also need to bear in mind is that requirement for legal and other also carries through into evaluation of compliance. So I think there we've covered the key areas. There's probably one final area that we must always bear in mind, or a couple of areas that we should always bear in mind, is that the management of this isn't just about what's new and what's coming through. What's often missed is legal and other requirements that are revoked, so things that have disappeared but we've still got them on our registers, or we control them as deemed to be applicable. It's equally important that they be managed as well, and there's something within the process that recognises how we communicate the fact that this particular piece of legislation has been revoked. And certainly in the United Kingdom there's been an amount of legislation which has in fact been revoked over the years. So not only does it keep our register of legislation and the process up to date, it could clearly affect process controls as well, operational controls, where we've embedded legal obligation in which could or should be removed. Of course, choosing to comply or not to comply with a piece of revoked legislation is an organisation's choice. The other thing to also consider is how this fits with documented information, particularly with regards to retention periods of registers and information contained therein. I think that again is really up to an organisation to determine, but within the boundaries of reasonable. The longer these records are kept, the longer it demonstrates our understanding and commitment to legal compliance. So I think that's very useful, particularly when, again, we go to talk about evaluation of compliance and how that then matches. So how long we keep this information might also drive evidence of evaluation of compliance. So I think there we've covered a good section of 613, and I hope that's been helpful.
ISO Builder Online, quality information for quality managers. ISO Builder is a registered trademark of Balkwell Limited. All online content is protected by international copyright and the Trademarks Act 1994. ISO Builder Online is not responsible, liable, nor necessarily support views as expressed by our podcast presenters in any way. They are their own interpretation and views. We accept no liability for any content. Patrons should always source conformatory opinions regarding interpretations of management systems in relation to their own situation and intended use. No content is intended to be offensive in any way. Balkwell Limited, Management Systems Consultancy Audit and Training. Contact us by email, davidbalkwell@balkwellltd.com or office@balkwellltd.com. Established in 1999.